Julius Caesar, as proconsul, was given command of all of the Roman legions north of the river Alps. And he was charged with keeping the peace among the various tribes living in these northern territories, the chief region of which was called Gaul, present-day France. Not waiting for developments to overwhelm him, because some of these tribes, while friendly, were undependable, and others, and most of them probably, were not even friendly to Rome, he decided to take the initiative and to incorporate all of this vast region of what is today France into the Roman Empire. And he took his legions on a 5-year campaign to pacify that region. And the Gallic tribes fought very hard and courageously, resisting his intrusions into their lives. Caesar wrote about his war in Gaul, a wonderful book that anyone from this audience who took second-year Latin in high school will remember very clearly. The Gauls were, of course, Celts, all right, in terms of ethnic background. And after his last victory over the Gauls, defeating Vercingetorix, I know you all remember that name from history, he looked across the channel separating Gaul from that large island off the northwest coast of Europe. There were Celts living there as well, and they had given sustenance and aid to the Gauls on the continent proper in their fight against Caesar. And the Romans have very long memories and are not terribly forgiving of opposition. So that Caesar then initiated 2 forays onto that island, just to leave an impression with them that Rome was here to stay and you're going to have to get used to it. He then went about other business, cementing himself ultimately as the leader and last non-emperor of the Roman configuration. The third Roman emperor, Claudius, decided, remembering of course that Caesar had been there before, decided to complete the pacification of those Celts on that large island. And so he took Roman legions onto that island and fought a number of serious engagements against the Celts living there. Boadicea is a famous name in the history of that island. She was, of course, the leader of the Celts. And in the course of the Roman attempt to pacify the island and to settle it and to rule it, she annihilated one whole Roman legion. But the Romans are never deterred by defeat. And ultimately, the Roman army prevailed. And that island was occupied about to the 3/5 and 2/3 level. The Romans finally decided when they got near to the upper reaches of the island that it really wasn't worth their while anymore to press on. So they consolidated their holding there. Because of these experiences, the Romans then had to label the places that they had recently occupied and the territories nearby that they had come to know better. They called that area of that big island that they occupied for over 300 years and for whose administration they were responsible. They called that part of the island Britannia. That's how Britain got its name. That part of the island on the north, to the north, that they didn't occupy, they labeled that portion of the island Caledonia. And of course, they knew as well about the smaller island to the west of the larger island, about half the size in square miles. And that island, which they did not invade at all, they called Hibernia. And that's where the name Hibernia comes from. So the Romans gave the names to these various places. As well, in their occupation of Britannia, the Romans were the ones who founded the great cities. London was founded by the Romans. It's a Roman town originally. All right? So that's how that came to be. The Celts in European history have had a rather unfortunate series of defeats that had to be survived. Not only were they defeated by Julius Caesar in Gaul, but they had been pushed relentlessly to the west. And even in Britannia proper, the Romans kind of pushed them to the west. So that the Celtic peoples of Europe, if you look for them today, you will find them on the fringes, kind of hanging on by their fingernails in places like Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland. You see where they are? They are also in the corner of northwestern Spain, in Galicia. And of course, Celts from the west of Britannia, what you know as Wales today, because the pressure got too great on them, moved over and settled the northwest peninsula of what is now France, in a province that was known as Brittany. So the Bretons are Celts related to the Welsh. The Scots are Celts related most closely to the Irish. And of course you have Celts elsewhere, as I say, on the fringes of Europe. Not a happy history. Now, on the island of Hibernia proper, those Celtic peoples occupied a territory that had been in existence and occupied for a very long time before. If one has ever visited Ireland, one has probably been told about Newgrange. Newgrange is an enormous mound on a hillside overlooking the Boyne Valley. And it has stones attached to its base, each one multiple tons of weight, not from that region. And Newgrange has been there for 5,000 plus years, longer than Stonehenge in England, longer. And if you were fortunate in a visit to Newgrange to be allowed to see what is inside, then you will observe that the large stone door, the original stone door, has a small hole in it, like so. And if you enter through that door, you go down a long corridor. And at the end of that long corridor is a very large stone. And the stone has on it a bullseye, right in the middle. And at the winter solstice, if the sun is out for 11 minutes, that sun shines through that door and hits the bullseye. Well, they weren't exactly unskilled. What the reason for that particular mound is remains somewhat a mystery even today. Nonetheless, it is a significant artifact from an earlier time when other people lived there. The Firbolgs, as they were called. All right? At any rate, these Hibernians then were on that island. And occasionally they raided up and down the coast of the larger island, as well as to the continent. And on one of these occasions, the raiders took prisoner, they kidnapped a young boy, the son of a Roman official. They brought him back to Hibernia. And he lived with them for many years. Eventually, he escaped from Hibernia, went to Rome, and became a priest. And then decided that he wanted to Christianize those people he had gotten to know when he was a younger boy. And so he went and became a missionary to Ireland. And that is how Patrick came to be revered on that island. Okay? The people living there, because of these raiding activities, when the Romans still controlled Britannia, were called Scotti Iracundi, the irascible Irish. And they became, in fact, very noticeable all over Europe. After Ireland was Christianized, and for some hundreds of years, Irish missionaries in turn went to the continent, and over 100 monasteries in Europe were founded by Irish monks. Bobbio in Italy, St. Gall in Switzerland, as far east as Vienna and Prague in Central and East Central Europe. So the Irish were very, very active on their part once Christianized. There were three contributions that the Irish made in different orders of importance, I suppose, to that large section of that main island which they were neighbors of and that was east of them. They went up there, and the first thing that the Irish did, of course, is they contributed to the Christianization of Scotland. But more important still, I suppose, for those of you who have an interest, they gave their name to the Scots. Scotti Iracundi, the irascible Irish, Scotland. So you think, well, Scotland is its own, it's got its own name. No, it's got an Irish name. All right? So the two contributions then of the Irish to the native Scots were, of course, the name of the country, the Christianization that took place there, and then, if one really wants to talk seriously, there is the story that was told by Tommy Makem, a famous Irish folk singer who died just a few years ago. And Tommy Makem said, you know, the Irish gave the bagpipes to the Scots, not the other way round. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he looked at and he said, and you know they didn't get the joke either. In turn, Ireland had faced a number of incursions. The Vikings, of course, raided the coasts of both Britannia, Caledonia on the one hand, and as well Hibernia on the other. They first were raiders, then they became traders, and eventually settlers. And it was the Vikings who founded the principal city of Ireland, eventually, Dublin. Dublin was a Viking settlement. It means dark pool, swampy land on the estuary of the Liffey River as it flows into the Irish Sea. All right? So there was this early Viking influence. But more important still, Ireland was influenced by what happened in that larger island. And one cannot talk about Ireland and the Irish without talking a great deal about what was happening on that larger island. When the Romans finally withdrew from their province in Britannia because of the pressures closer to home that they had to address, which ultimately took them down, Germanic tribes then came into the poor Celts of Britannia. They got no relief. Germanic tribes came, principally the Angles and the Saxons. The Angles gave their name to the country, England. What is the name of the church? Anglican Church. So the Germanic tribe, the Angles, gave their name to the country and to the religion of the country, the Christian religion of the country, on the one hand. But if you read in history books, for the most part, these Germanic peoples are identified as Saxons, right? And they came to rule over Britannia. So you have the Saxons. But then the Saxons were invaded, again from Gaul. this time from that northern section known as Normandy. And the Normans were Norsemen. They were originally Vikings. And they had settled, and they had raided, traded, and then settled in that region of what is today northern France. Okay? But in the process, over the process of development and time, these Normans became very much Frankified. By the way, France is named after another Germanic tribe, the Franks. So France may be a Romance country in terms of language because it has had a very strong Roman administration and history, and the language of France, of course, came from the south. Nonetheless, the Germanic tribes swept not only into what became England, but also France. So the Franks gave their name to France, the Angles gave their name to England, and the Romans gave their name to Ireland. Once the Normans had made good their invasion of England and settled in, finally, two of the Norman knights with considerable properties in the west of Britain were invited by disputing Irish to come to the smaller island. Robert Fitzstephen was one, and Richard II, Earl of Pembroke, called Strongbow, was the other. And they were invited over to help settle some disputes, and they made themselves at home in Ireland and thought to increase their own political and economic influence by remaining involved there. The King of England, Henry II, was not about to allow two of his knights that measure of independence. And so he went and visited the island as well and told his two knights, you know, you hold your properties in fief to me, and you will, whatever you acquire, whatever influence, whatever properties, whatever businesses, whatever, you owe me that loyalty, and I will demand it. All right. Furthermore, of course, these Normans wanted to convert that territory in Ireland that they occupied early on to the Norman way of doing things, or the Roman way too. That is, you have a king of England, all right? You have the development of a system of feudalism where knights have to promise certain obedience. They own huge properties, but these properties have to be surrendered, and then the king gives them back to you on certain conditions. So when they went over to Ireland, they expected that in the Norman administration of these Irish territories, that these Norman English rules would prevail. The problem is that the Irish lived very differently. Ireland was divided into clans. That's the way the Celts did things. Now, you did have a high king of Ireland who had his headquarters in Tara, in what is now County Meath, north and a little bit west of Dublin. And the high king was the titular head of all of the clans in Ireland, but his authority did not extend to the clan level. He could not regulate any of the behavior or decisions of the clans, not directly. He had a position of influence, but he had no authority directly. The clans elected their chiefs, elected them. The chiefs of the various clans could not pass the clan down from father to son or designate their successor. Every chief, once dead, that was the end of it, and a new chief had to be elected. All of the property of the clan, all of the assets of the clan belonged to the clan, not to the chief. And there was just this basic lack of understanding between the Norman English and the Irish because of this difference politically and economically in how they operated. This was, I think, one of the base reasons for the difficulties that the Norman English had in their Irish venture. all right? That relatively small territory in the east of Ireland that was controlled by the Norman English in the early years came to be called the Pale, P-A-L-E. So in Irish history, they talk about the Pale, that's what they mean. That's how matters stood for a long time. You have to remember now, you've got a footprint by the Norman English in Ireland. You've got a Viking history, and you also have some Spanish influence in the West, because the west of Ireland traded quite a bit with Spain. Let me diverge for a moment. I like to do this anyway, to tell you about one of those interesting episodes in the west of Ireland. It has to do with the city of Galway, and the fact that the city of Galway kind of twinned with one of the Spanish cities. And the son of the mayor of the city of Galway was invited to spend time with the twin city as the guest of the mayor of that city. In turn, that mayor sent his son to Galway. In the course of which that son's stay in Galway, the son and the son of the Irish mayor got into a dispute. And the Spanish visitor was killed. There was a trial, and as a result of the trial, the Irish son of the mayor was found not guilty. His father realized that this was a miscarriage of justice. He had betrayed his friendship and the confidence that had been established between these two poles of economic and social interchange. He was not about to allow that kind of justice to prevail in his jurisdiction. And so he took matters into his own hand and decreed the execution of his own son. The name of that mayor was Lynch. And that's how the word lynching came into the English language. All right, so if somebody asks you, you'll say, that's where that came from. That was in the 900s. Yeah. Okay, so you have these influences then developing, all right, between the two sides. Now, the important difference in the relationship between the large island and the small comes only in the 1600s, the 17th century. By that time, the ambition that the Norman English had to establish great power strength because of the vast territories that they controlled in what is today France. They married French princesses, Aquitaine, remember her, all right, and Gascony and others. They had huge territories. And so the English and the French competed. The King of England and the King of France competed for control over these territories. All of the great battles, Crécy, Agincourt, were won by the English. The war, after more than 100 years, was won by the French. And the English were expelled from all of the territories that they had once controlled because of the Norman inheritance, because of the intermarriages, and because of conquest, all of those territories in what is now modern France. And the Norman English were looking for other ways of exercising great power strength in Europe and elsewhere. Britain went into its imperial mode at this time. They also decided to incorporate Ireland into their territory, the British territory in general. All right. So in the 1600s, then, you have a concerted effort by the British to control all of Ireland. There were three major military campaigns that were fought. The first of them culminated in 1601, right at the beginning of the century, with the victory of the British over the Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell. And that victory resulted in what the Irish call the Flight of the Earls. These two very powerful rulers of clans left Ireland. The land that they vacated and all of the people on land that had supported them were evicted from those lands. And as it happened, both of these earls had their territories, they were the clans, in the north, in what you know today as Ulster. So the first plantations of Scots, and of course by this time the Reformation had come, so there were Scots Presbyterians into Ireland, occurred in the early 1600s as a result of the flight of the earls after their defeat at Kinsale. In mid-century, a major dispute in England proper, Charles I, the king, lost his head in the battles that took place, and Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads came to control the country and the government of Britain, but as well they wanted to ensure their control of Ireland. And so Cromwell's army invaded Ireland in 1641, and for 11 years went throughout Ireland, raising havoc everywhere and decimating the Irish population. In the course of Cromwell's 11 years in Ireland, 1/3 of the Irish population was killed. 1/3. And to give you just one particular example, the city of Drogheda, which is just on the Boyne River, just near that wonderful mound I talked about. It's not too far away from there at all. The city of Drogheda had resisted. It was a fortified city, had a walled city. And Cromwell and his troops laid siege to Drogheda. They captured the city, and every man, woman, and child in that city was killed. Everyone. And that happened, generally speaking, Cromwell's troops destroyed, razed to the ground all of the cities in Ireland, almost all of them. So Ireland was pacified. The bitterness has not gone away in some minds in Ireland even today, but you can understand. And since Cromwell was not able to pay his troops once the war in Ireland was over, what he did was confiscate yet additional extensive parcels of land, and he paid his troops in Irish land, taken from the Irish. Okay. So that now the vast majority of landowners in Ireland were not Irish at all. They were Scots or English. Finally, at the end of the century, in 1690, again as a result of affairs in England, Charles II had died, and he was succeeded by his brother, who had been Duke of York. By the way, while Duke of York, Britain came into possession of all of the Dutch territory in the colonies, American colonies. And the city of New Amsterdam was renamed in his honor, and that's how New York got its name. But the Duke of York became James II. The problem that a lot of Englishmen had with James II was, of course, he was Catholic. And so these people arranged for a coup d'etat and invited William of Orange. He was stadtholder of the Netherlands, ruler of the Netherlands under certain restrictive conditions. The name Orange comes from France. The territory where he got his title from is French. He was Dutch, but he became King of England, if that's confusing enough. He was married to Mary, of course, who was a Stuart. And so William and Mary, yes, they named a college after them in Virginia. So William then came into control of the government in England. And again, the last great battle between William of Orange and James II was fought again in Ireland. And well, there's a castle north of Dublin called Malahide. The Talbot family owns that castle. On the morning of the Great Battle of the Boyne in 1690. 21 members, male adult members of the Talbot family gathered for breakfast. And then they all left, joining James II's forces in the Boyne Valley. William won that battle, and not one of those 21 Talbots came out of it alive. So if ever you visit Ireland and want to see a beautiful castle, it's still there, occupied by the descendants of the Talbots still. But the memory of that day is something you can see inside the castle proper, where all of the members of one family, the male adult members of one family, died on a single day. At any rate, William won. And once again, he reduced the holdings of the Irish in land. So that by the end of, from the beginning to the end of the 17th century, the Irish proper, and the Irish constituted 80% of the whole population. The Irish proper owned only 7% of the land in the country. All right? We have, and we'll talk about this now, we have, as a result of the 1600s and these wars of subjugation, by which England took control of Ireland politically and otherwise, we have in this situation an interesting configuration of four stakeholders. The principal stakeholder, obviously, was now the British government, which came into control of the entire island. The King and Parliament were represented in Ireland by a man who was the viceroy of the country, and he went by the official name of the Lord Lieutenant. And the administration, the British administration of Ireland was concentrated in Dublin Castle, which is in downtown Dublin. And that's where the British administrative officials were located for their administration of the country. Ireland was under the administration of the British Crown and Parliament and controlled by the British. Okay? The Irish Parliament, which had existed until this time, was not dissolved, but Poyning's law really was held over the heads of the Irish Parliament. Poyning was one of the British administrators in Dublin Castle. And Poyning's law was simply this, that the Irish Parliament could not discuss any issues when in session except if approved, except with prior approval of the British Parliament. And they certainly could not pass any legislation of which the British Parliament disapproved. So the Irish Parliament was subordinated and rendered moribund, really. That was Poyning's law. Underneath the British government control, the second stakeholder was what was called the Protestant ascendancy. These were the large landowners who had been given these grants of land, and now they had a major economic stake in Ireland. They had come over from England, and they owned these lands. They constituted the educated and business as well as the political elite of the country. They were the lawyers, the doctors. Trinity College was founded by Elizabeth I just before the beginning of the year 1595, and it was meant to provide a vehicle for this Protestant ascendancy to exercise its natural leadership abilities on the island. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these people graduated from Trinity College. They ran the businesses in the country. They ran local government. These large landowners tended to be the justices of the peace in the countryside. So they, they made legal decisions, and in other ways, they controlled the local administration of the country under the British Crown. And they were privileged, but limited politically, because the Irish Parliament couldn't do what it wanted to do. And of course, they were subject to the laws of Parliament and not able themselves to influence those laws. There was no representation by Ireland, by the way, in the British Parliament at this time. So that's the second. Third stakeholder, of course, were the Scots, who are now Scots-Irish, concentrated in what is the province of Ulster. Ireland, by the way, as it developed, had four major provinces: Ulster in the north, Leinster in the east, Munster in the south, and Connaught in the west. So when they talk about the four sons of Ireland in song, if you've ever heard any Irish songs, you'll know what the reference is, all right? Thomas Davis wrote that famous song about the four green fields in Ireland, and how one of those green fields is not Irish anymore. Okay. At any rate, the Scots-Irish in the northeast were concentrated there. And they had the advantage of what was called the Ulster custom. That is, they were secure in their tenancy where they didn't own the land, as long as they paid their rent, and the rents were much more reasonable there than elsewhere. But they were discriminated against in many different ways because they were Presbyterian and hence considered dissenters. And as a result, as with the Catholics, they were not able to gain admission to Trinity College. So they could not become professional people in Ireland. And you know the Scots. The Scots, you know what the Scots are like. Well, the Scots-Irish are Scots with an edge. All right? And they very much resented not having the privileges of their Protestant religion. And they had to accept discrimination too. I mean, it was one thing to be better off than the Catholics, but that was all they could say, and they had a little bit better tenure in land. The Catholic population, of course, suffered the most. A series of penal laws were promulgated in the 1600s to discriminate against Catholics in politics, economics, education, religion. First of all, the Catholics in Ireland at this time now had to pay tithes in support of the Church of Ireland. The Church of Ireland was the Church of England in Ireland. So they had to pay for the support, even though 85% of them, or 80 to 85%, were not members of the church. All of the Catholic churches had been confiscated, and Catholics were not permitted education at any level, elementary or otherwise. What developed in Ireland were schools run surreptitiously, hedge schools they were called, where instructions were out of doors because they didn't have any place to hold instructions, and usually where Catholic priests, who were not allowed to be in Ireland, gave instruction to the young to give them literacy. The Irish had been famous for literacy early on. The Book of Kells, I mean, and Irish experience from an earlier time would indicate that they valued education highly, and indeed they did. So they then had this severe limitation in terms of education, the practice of religion, their religion, and of course they didn't own land. They were almost all rural, and yet, except for 7% of them, they were tenants on land, subject to the whim of the landowner. And famous, of course, stories can be told about rack renting. That is, every time an Irish tenant would improve his property, the land that he worked, or the cottage that he lived in, he would be charged an additional sum in rent for the improvements. After all, you're living in a better property now, you have to pay more, which very much discouraged it. And if they made trouble, they just simply were evicted, and somebody else was brought in who was just happy to have some place to work, to land. So those, and of course, they could not participate either in the economic life of the country. So these penal laws then were ground down the majority population in Ireland and impoverished them. That was the situation in Ireland through the 1600s. And at the end of the 1600s, this is what you found. Now, what happened to those Irish who had the ability and wanted to make something better out of their lives? They left the country. They simply packed their bags, and however they could, they left. And they went to places all around Europe and the New World. You can go to some places today to see some evidences of it. There are many examples that can be given, but let's just give a few examples. If you happen to be visiting downtown Madrid someday, and you will notice there one of the very, very large boulevards in the center of Madrid, Avenida O'Donnell, all right, in honor of a very famous Irishman who went to Spain. If, in fact, you went to South America and wanted to find out, from people who live in Chile, how it was that eventually they freed themselves from Spanish control, they will tell you, well, one of the great heroes of the Chilean independence movement was O'Higgins. And if you go to France, one of the great marshals of the French army was MacMahon. And if you like your cognac, you go to the distillery there, which is still very famous worldwide, Hennessy's. And if you should happen to be in Austria, and remember now Austria was a great power under the Habsburgs, the longest serving chancellor in the history of the Habsburg Empire, and the closest friend of the emperor of that time, was a man named Edward Taaffe, T-A-A-F-F-E. Taaffe's family was also one of those Irish families that left. Many more examples could be given. These people collectively in Ireland, if you happen to be there and the conversation comes round to the subject, these people are known as the wild geese. The wild geese. Oh, all right? Yeah. Okay, well, that's just the name by which they are known. Now, as we move into the 1700s, the situation begins to change. And we're going to talk about that change and what happens that dramatically alters the relationship between the big island and the little island, and how the Irish came to a point of some expectation that things were going to get better.